3 years ago, I accidentally became the guy who could shut off every streetlight in our neighborhood. And honestly, if you had told me back then that a fight over two little girls riding bicycles would end with an entire subdivision begging me for mercy, I probably would have laughed in your face. But that was before I met Leonard Grayson, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, a man who somehow managed to make every conversation feel like you were being audited by the IRS. The whole thing started on a Tuesday evening, right around sunset, one of those warm North Carolina evenings where the air smells like fresh-cut grass and somebody's barbecue drifting over from 3 houses down. My twin daughters, Ava and Lily, had just gotten their training wheels removed that weekend, and for the first time they were finally balancing on their own, wobbling all over the sidewalk in front of our house while I walked behind them pretending not to panic every time they swerved toward the curb. They were laughing so hard they could barely pedal straight, and for a minute, it felt like one of those moments you wish you could freeze forever. Then Leonard showed up. I saw him crossing the street in his little golf visor and khaki shorts, carrying that stupid leather binder he brought to every HOA meeting like it contained nuclear launch codes. Even my girls noticed him and slowed down a little because everybody in Willow Creek knew Leonard only came over when somebody was supposedly breaking a rule. He stopped right in front of Ava's bike and held up a hand like he was directing traffic. "Girls, hop off the bikes for me." His voice had that fake, polite tone people use when they're already halfway into an argument. I walked up beside the girls and said, "Everything all right?" Leonard opened the binder, flipped through a stack of laminated pages, then adjusted his reading glasses real slow, almost like he was enjoying the performance. "Actually, no, Ethan. Section 8.3 of the Community Safety Guidelines clearly prohibits recreational cycling on HOA pedestrian pathways." I blinked at him for a second because I genuinely thought he was joking. "They're 8 years old, Leonard." He nodded once. "Exactly. Which increases liability concerns." Ava looked up at me completely confused. "Dad, are we in trouble?" That question hit me harder than it probably should have. Because the truth is, my girls had already had a rough year. Their mom had moved to Arizona the year before, chasing some marketing job and apparently a completely different life. And ever since then, I'd been trying to hold things together with duct tape and caffeine. The bikes were my idea, my way of giving them something normal again, something happy. Leonard kept talking while my daughters stood there holding their handlebars like somebody had just canceled Christmas. "We've received multiple complaints about tire marks on the sidewalks, near collisions with pedestrians, and concerns regarding property value aesthetics." Property value aesthetics. I swear to God, those were the exact words he used. I looked around the street, completely empty except for old Mrs. Delaney watering flowers across the road, and she actually gave me this tiny embarrassed shrug like even she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I said, "So where exactly are they supposed to ride?" Leonard closed the binder with a soft clap. "The nearest public recreation trail is approximately 2 miles west." I laughed once because I thought maybe he didn't hear himself. "Leonard, they're children." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And this is a private community? Ethan, rules are rules." Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile either. The kind of smile somebody gives when they enjoy finally having authority over another person. And standing there watching my daughters fight back tears over a damn bicycle rule, something in me shifted a little. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about people like Leonard. They don't really care about rules. Rules are just the excuse. What they actually care about is control. That night, after I tucked the girls into bed, I sat alone in my garage, staring at their bikes, leaning against the wall, and I kept replaying the look on their faces over and over. I should have let it go. Honestly, a smarter man probably would have. But around midnight, while digging through some old paperwork looking for absolutely no reason at all, I found the original installation agreement for the neighborhood lighting system. And suddenly, I remembered something Leonard had forgotten. Something very important. See, about 3 years before the bicycle incident, Willow Creek had this big neighborhood safety campaign after somebody's car got broken into near the front entrance. Nothing major was even stolen, just a laptop and some golf clubs. But the HOA acted like we were living in Gotham City all of a sudden. Leonard especially. He turned every monthly meeting into a dramatic presentation about crime statistics and community vulnerability exposure, which is apparently how suburban HOA presidents say the words, "Someone took Steve Calloway's set." Eventually, the board approved this massive upgrade to energy-efficient LED street lighting throughout the entire subdivision. Fancy poles, underground wiring, backup systems. The whole thing cost an absurd amount of money. And because Willow Creek was built in phases over the years, they needed one centralized location for the transformer hub and control panel. My property happened to sit almost dead center in the neighborhood. At the time, Leonard came to me acting surprisingly friendly, talking about community partnership and neighborhood pride, said they needed access to a small corner of my backyard near the detached shed. I remember him actually putting a hand on my shoulder saying, "This would really help keep everyone's family safe." Ethan, back then I still believed people meant what they said, so I agreed, didn't charge them a dime. Let the contractors install the master control unit right beside my workshop because honestly, I figured helping the neighborhood was just what decent people did. The entire lighting grid for Willow Creek ran through a secured metal cabinet mounted against the back wall of my shed, protected by a weatherproof enclosure and a master breaker switch labeled Community Light and Distribution. Most days I forgot it was even there. Until now, around 1 in the morning, I walked out into the backyard holding that installation paperwork in one hand and a beer in the other. The neighborhood was dead quiet except for crickets and the distant hum of air conditioners. I unlocked the shed, stepped inside, and stared at that breaker panel for a long minute. Even then, I wasn't fully planning to do it. At least, that's what I told myself. I think part of me just wanted to feel like I had some kind of leverage after watching my girls get humiliated over something so stupid. But then I remembered Lily asking if she was in trouble for riding a bicycle, and before I could second-guess myself, I reached over and flipped the main switch down. The sound was weirdly small, just click, but outside the shed windows, the entire neighborhood instantly vanished into darkness. Every streetlight, every decorative pathway lamp, every illuminated entrance sign, gone. I stepped outside and looked down Willow Creek Boulevard where 20 minutes earlier everything had been glowing warm and suburban perfect. Now it looked like a blackout zone after a storm. And I know this sounds terrible, but standing there in the dark, I smiled. The first 24 hours were honestly kind of hilarious. The HOA sent out one of those mass emails blaming a temporary utility interruption, while neighbors wandered around with phone flashlights trying not to trip over landscaping stones. By the second night, the complaints started pouring into the community Facebook group. People were furious. Somebody posted a blurry picture of a raccoon digging through trash cans with the caption, "This never happened before the lights went out." One woman claimed the darkness had completely altered the emotional atmosphere of the neighborhood. My personal favorite was a retired guy named Dennis who wrote an entire paragraph about how poor lighting negatively affected property values and probably violated state constitutional law somehow. Meanwhile, every evening after dinner, I rolled the garage door open, turned on the lights, and taught my daughters how to ride bikes in circles across the driveway. And for the first time all week, they were smiling again. On the third day, my phone rang while I was grilling hot dogs. "Leonard." I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got me. "Ethan," he said immediately, voice tight with frustration. "Have you noticed anything unusual with the lighting equipment behind your shed?" I looked out at Ava, attempting a sharp turn and nearly crashing into a recycling bin. "Not really." "Why?" There was this pause where I could practically hear him grinding his teeth. "The electrical contractor says the system is offline manually, not mechanically." I took a bite of my hot dog before answering. "Huh. Weird. We'd like access to inspect the control panel." "Tonight?" Immediately, I leaned back in my chair. "Sorry, Leonard. Not a good time. Girls are practicing." Another silence. Then he lowered his voice into that fake calm tone again. "Ethan, the community relies on those lights." I laughed softly. "And my daughters relied on those sidewalks." Then I hung up. After that, things escalated fast. By day 4, people started genuinely panicking. Willow Creek had become so dependent on perfect suburban convenience that a little darkness felt like the apocalypse. Neighbors who'd never spoken to each other suddenly stood outside every night, complaining together like survivors in a disaster movie. Somebody tripped jogging and sprained an ankle near the mailbox cluster. A teenager backed his truck into a decorative stone planter because he couldn't see the curb properly. Delivery drivers kept missing addresses. One Amazon van somehow ended up halfway across a flower bed near Cedar Lane. And every single evening, Leonard drove slowly past my house in his little silver Lexus, glaring at my brightly lit garage while my daughters zigzagged across the driveway laughing their heads off. Honestly, I think that part bothered him more than the blackout itself, because no matter how hard he tried to control the neighborhood, my girls still looked happy. About a week into the blackout, The HOA hired a private electrical contractor named Vince, this huge guy with sunburned arms and steel-toe boots who showed up at my door around noon carrying a clipboard. He actually seemed decent, which almost made me feel bad. Almost. He introduced himself and said, "Look, man, I traced the issue to the master distribution panel behind your shed. Should only take me 20 minutes to fix." I nodded slowly. "Probably, but there's a problem." He frowned. "What problem?" "Liability." The second I said that word, I almost laughed because suddenly I sounded exactly like Leonard. Vince blinked. "Excuse me." I crossed my arms. "See, according to my homeowner's insurance policy, unauthorized access to high-voltage equipment on private property could create serious liability exposure." He stared at me for a second before realization slowly spread across his face. This man actually looked over my shoulder toward the neighborhood streets, then back at me, and I swear he was fighting a smile. "You're messing with the HOA, aren't you?" I shrugged. "Rules are rules." Vince burst out laughing so hard he had to step off the porch. Before leaving, he shook his head and muttered, "Honestly, good for you." But the real turning point came on night 9, because that's when Leonard finally showed up at my house without the binder, without the fake authority, and without the smug little smile he'd been wearing since the day he stopped my daughters on those bikes. It was just after sunset when Leonard knocked on my door that 9th night, and the second I opened it, I could tell something had changed. He wasn't alone this time either. Standing behind him were 3 other HOA board members, including Marianne Keller, the vice president who usually acted like she wanted to disappear whenever Leonard started one of his little power speeches at meetings. Nobody was holding clipboards. Nobody looked confident. Honestly, they looked exhausted. Behind me, the garage door was open, and my daughters were still outside riding circles around each other under the bright overhead lights, laughing every time one of them nearly tipped over. Leonard glanced toward them for half a second before looking back at me. "Can we talk?" No attitude, no superiority, just tired. I leaned against the doorframe. "Depends. Is this conversation gonna violate Section 8.3? Marianne actually snorted, trying not to laugh, and Leonard shot her a quick glare before exhaling hard through his nose. "Ethan, this situation has gotten out of hand." I looked out toward the dark street behind them. The entire neighborhood sat under this eerie black silence except for porch lights glowing here and there like scattered candles. It almost looked peaceful now. "Seems like people are finally spending time outside talking to each other," I said. "Maybe the darkness is bringing the community together." One of the board members rubbed his forehead. "We've had 3 minor accidents this week." "That sounds frustrating." Leonard's jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might explode and go right back into HOA dictator mode, but instead he surprised me. He looked over at my daughters again and said quietly, "I didn't realize they were having that much fun out there." That caught me off guard, because up until then, Leonard had felt less like a person and more like a walking rulebook in khaki shorts. I stayed quiet while he continued. "My son." He stopped himself, swallowing hard. "When my son was little, he got hit by a car riding his bike in our old neighborhood." The air shifted a little after that, not enough to excuse everything he'd done, but enough to make me finally understand where all this obsession with control came from. Leonard rubbed his hands together nervously. "After that happened, I spent years trying to prevent every possible risk around me. Every accident, every lawsuit, every complaint. I guess eventually I stopped seeing actual people. For the first time since this whole thing started." He sounded human, tired, embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed. Marianne stepped forward holding a folder. "The board voted tonight to permanently remove the sidewalk cycling restriction." She handed me the paperwork. "We're also adding designated play zone signs throughout the neighborhood and lowering speed limits on residential streets." I flipped through the papers while Leonard stood there staring at the driveway concrete. Then Marianne added, "And we'd like to formally compensate you for hosting the lighting equipment on your property. $200 a month, retroactive starting this year." I looked at Leonard. What changed? He gave this small, bitter laugh. "Turns out people care a lot more about lighting than bicycle tire marks." "Fair enough." Behind me, Lily suddenly yelled, "Dad, watch this." She wobbled down the driveway trying to bop a tiny wheelie and immediately almost fell sideways into a bush. Ava laughed so hard she dropped her bike, and for the first time, Leonard laughed too. Just a quick little laugh before he caught himself. But it was real. I looked back at the dark street one more time, then finally stepped aside. "All right," I said. Let's go turn your lights back on. The whole group followed me through the backyard in silence. Crickets chirped in the trees while porch lights glowed faintly through the fences around us. When we reached the shed, Leonard stopped beside the metal control cabinet and stared at it like the thing had personally ruined his life. I unlocked the panels slowly, then rested my hand on the master breaker. You know, I said. All this over two little girls riding bicycles. Leonard sighed. Yeah, I know. Then I flipped the switch. Instantly, the entire neighborhood roared back to life. One by one, streetlights flickered on down every block, stretching into the distance like dominoes made of light. The entrance signs glowed again. Sidewalk lamps hummed softly awake. Somewhere down the street, somebody actually cheered. And I swear, from yards away, you could hear people opening front doors just to see if the lights were really back. Leonard stood there blinking under the fresh glow like a man walking out of a cave. Then he looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. I owe your girls an apology. The next morning, Willow Creek looked completely different. Kids were outside everywhere. Scooters, skateboards, bikes. Parents actually sitting in lawn chairs talking to each other while traffic slowed down around the new yellow Key It's AT Play signs the HOA rushed to install overnight. And my daughters? They rode those bikes all over the neighborhood like they owned the place. Sometimes I still think about how close I came to just letting it go that first night, keeping my mouth shut, telling the girls life isn't fair and loading their bikes into the truck every weekend just to find some distant park. Maybe that would have been the mature thing to do. Or maybe people like Leonard only change when somebody finally forces them to sit in the dark long enough to realize how ridiculous they've become. So now I gotta ask you, if somebody tried to take away something this small from your kids, something innocent and joyful just because they had the power to do it, would you have fought back the way I did? Or would you have let the rules win? Let me know in the comments. Because honestly, even now, part of me still isn't sure whether I handled this like a good father or just a very petty man with access to a breaker switch.